Howdy, folks. This is Radical Liberation from St. Louis, Missouri in the United States. More on St. Louis shortly and where I live, or sort of the area I live in when we get to a mini. But first, we have Mad Mercenary, as usual, from Australia.
Hello.
And we have as a special guest someone who we've gotten to know and love in our communities, some of our discussion communities, and that's Mathias. Welcome, Mathias. Mathias. Sorry.
Hello.
You taught me how to say your name, Mathias, right?
Yeah, it's fine either way. I respond to
yeah, and Mathias, is there anything that you feel comfortable revealing about yourself?
Well, I mean, I can say I work in finance. I am very interested in economics and politics, and well, in particular, the economic aspects of politics, investments, things like that.
Yeah, and wouldn't it be fair to say, I don't think that's what we're getting into this time, but you have an interest in what I think of as anarcho-capitalist type topics like private communities and things like that, right?
Yeah, I would say hobby and topics, to be specific.
Okay, sure.
Just to make clear exactly what flavor I am.
Right, and I mention that because we have a penciled-in cigar stream, I think it is, right? Was it going to be a cigar stream? Yeah, and I think you and I
25th.
both. Yeah, you and I both were planning to do that. I still call it penciled because I haven't discussed it with my wife yet. But anyway, so it's not in ink yet or blood. Okay.
Charlemagne is also joining.
Oh, okay. Good. He can tell us.
Just remember
the cultural.
Just
challenges.
remember, Radlib. Just remember, happy wife, happy life. Don't upset her.
Oh yeah, no, that's why I'm never fully committed until she and I are in agreement about me doing a show or an appearance or whatever. Because as you can imagine, our plate is quite full. Okay, anyway, so I just mentioned that because that's upcoming in a couple weeks, and I think our audience would find that conversation really interesting. So keep your eye out for it. Anyway, but today we're going to do something different. Which is I'm sorry, did I say right? GeoEconomics, right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
GeoEconomics. That'll be our main topic. Before we get into that, I had something that I'm surprised I feel like I've talked about on the show briefly once before, but it's kind of strange that I haven't talked more about I don't know what to call it, the Black Americans, basically, Black folks in America, in the United States, from an economic angle and from some various other angles, because it just so happens I have sort of a peculiar set of knowledge, intersecting knowledge on this topic. So I just wanted to touch on one part of it. I'll just tell you my background real quick, which is that through my church, I worked with a group of inner city children for 10 years, from North St. Louis, the north of the city of St. Louis, which is one of the most violent areas of one of the most violent cities in the United States. At least for some years, the top city for murders would trade between Washington, D.C. and St. Louis. I haven't checked those stats recently, but St. Louis usually is up there. And when we say St. Louis, we really mean the city of St. Louis, because I actually live in St. Louis County. But interestingly, as of 4 years ago, I live in a part of St. Louis County that I didn't know much about. I don't know how that is, because I know a lot about this area. But when I moved up here, I found that the north, I moved to the top of St. Louis County, and the north of St. Louis County is a Black area, predominantly at this point. I mean, I haven't checked the stats, but just from shopping and living here, that's what I see. Predominantly Black area. it's a black middle class area. And it seems to me, feel free to correct me, guys, but it seems to me that we don't hear much about the black middle class. The press tends to talk more, obviously, about the violence that happens in the ghetto areas or whatever you want to call them, and of course, there's the whole cultural aspect with rap, sort of gangster rap and stuff like that, which really plays up sort of the thug life aspect of Black America. But there are other aspects of Black America, and I think it's kind of a shame that we don't know more about them. So I just wanted to teach you a little. This is an interesting site. It's called blackdemographics.com. In fact, let me keep up my good habit of sharing links. Here's the link for you of what I'm showing you right now. So blackdemographics.com, this page is called the African American Middle Class. And one of the things they talk about, or one of the things they show, is just the size of it. So on the right, you see all households, and you have, according to, admittedly somewhat arbitrary, but they picked an annual household income of $50,000 to $150,000 as being middle class. And by that measure, 45% of Americans are in the middle class bracket. You have 16% that are above that in the upper middle or upper class. And let me do some quick addition, 40% below that in the working class / poverty, and just outright poverty brackets. So 45% overall. Black households are 36%. Now, I thought that was worth highlighting because I would think that people coming from outside of America in particular might think that Black Americans are hardly represented in the middle class at all, given the picture that I think Hollywood gives of America. So I wanted to highlight that. And there's some other things. It was kind of hitting on some other topics we've discussed. They discuss median net worth, and they note that the crash of 2008, the Great Recession, due to the Great Recession, starting about 2008, that impacted Black Americans more because they had more of their net worth tied up in their house, for example. And as we know, in 2008, real estate prices took a real beating. So anyway, there's some more detail on here that's, I think, interesting in light of discussions we've had. But you do notice that Black net worth is quite a bit below the U.S. median, which is the dashed line, and then white non-Hispanic is above that. So there are certainly differences on average between Black Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, so forth. But there's a growing middle class. It's been growing all along. But in particular, I think, and I wish I had a graph just showing the growth of the middle class, and I don't think they have that. But it's been growing all along, and I think in particular in the last, 50 to 60 years, it has been growing despite many impediments, as I might probably have discussed in the past. The welfare state and many things like this have really arrested a lot of the progress that was happening prior to the Great Society programs of LBJ in the 60s. So anyway, there's more to be said, but there is a Black middle class. If you hadn't heard that, I wanted you to know. I live in an area that is, as far as I can tell, entirely Black middle class, maybe some working class, but as far as I can tell, pretty much Black middle class. It's huge. It's a huge area. It takes me a long time to drive through it when I'm going to work, which is just a bit south of this area. It takes me like a half hour to get to work, and I'm mostly driving through this Black middle class area. So it's a really large area. There's many, many millions of Black Americans who are doing okay. Now, it's interesting, a friend who I just was talking to today, who's kind of plugged into the Black American community, she was telling me that the protests have been the middle class Blacks. If you see Black people at the protests, it tends to be the middle class Blacks. The riots have been the lower class, I guess, drawn from the lower brackets here, the poverty or working class poverty segments. So there's actually a class difference in terms of what we've been seeing with the protests and the riots this year with the Black Lives Matter stuff. So I thought that was an interesting kernel of information. So anyway, that's all. Any comments from you guys before we move on?
No, unfortunately, I don't really have much to add here because, I mean, in Europe, it's very different than the US, and I haven't ever lived in a community like the one that you're living in, so it's very limited what I can say, I think.
Yeah, and I guess I would just mention what someone was saying. I forget who, one of our circle, was talking about how it seems strange the way that the peculiarly American aspect of Black Lives Matter and things like that. They've exported it. They've tried to export it everywhere. I don't know that I've really seen it that big on the continent, Mathias. Have you seen Black Lives Matter like protests going on throughout the continent?
Not in Portugal, where I'm located. I mean, I've seen some news about some minor protests in Denmark, for example, which is where I originally come from. Mm-hmm. But it's definitely, I mean, it's not riots like you have in the US. Right. It's interesting to me, though, it's interesting to me that it doesn't appear that the black middle class are the ones that are rioting. Is there any statistics on this page that you posted about, other things like crime statistics, for example, what the difference is between them? And
I don't think so. This is pretty much focused on economics. Okay. Black financial savings, black financial accounts, net worth by asset. So you can sort of see where people's assets are relative to Black Americans versus white Americans, and stuff like that. But yeah,
that the wealthier the people get, the less crime.
Right. That would be. I wish I had stats on it, Mathias, but that is kind of my guess. That's part of the reason I wanted to bring this up because anyone who's been around in our circles on the internet long enough has heard the what is it, the 8/50 or whatever. 8% of the population commits 50% of the violent crimes, or I don't know. I'm not getting the stats right. But I think actually
it would be interesting to know what percentage of the different classes of blacks are actually committing most of that crime, because what I assume is that it's probably not the middle class.
Exactly. So I bet you look at this chart here and you've got upper class, upper middle class, working class accounting for all but let's see, 20, about 32, right? All but about 32% of Black Americans are in the working class and above. Let's just imagine for a moment that most of that 50% of that 50% number that gets tossed around is coming from this like 30% of blacks that are in the lower economic zone here. That would mean that instead of it being 8/50, it's 2/50 or something, right?
And I imagine you can further subdivide it because it's usually young men that are committing most of the crime, right? And one of the big problems in the US, as far as I can understand from like reading Thomas Sowell and so on, is the minimum wage is disadvantaging young black males. Like significantly more than any other part of the American population. It makes it very hard for them to get into the job market, and that, I mean, that's how you get to the middle class. You need to start working from an early age.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. When I was doing ministry with the young black children in the ghetto area, the high crime area, I remember thinking about young men being lost to the streets. That is, at a certain age, they were young and they were kind of open-minded, like when they're 12 or 13, I could see them being open to getting involved with doing projects at the church and stuff like that, but if we didn't have an influence on them and they didn't have some good family influence, by the time those same young men were 19 or 20, they were just hanging out on the street corner with these red eyes from, being high on something, drunk or high or both, and just no use to anyone, Like by a certain age, that's what I meant by lost to the streets. They'd be caught up in gang culture or whatever you want to call it, this culture that results in someone who isn't very productive with their life. And the chances of them being middle class were pretty much zero at that point, right? And what Thomas Sowell shows in the immediate post-World War II era, when the minimum wage was really being instituted, like in the 40s and so forth, is that Black Americans actually had a lower unemployment rate. That is, they were more employed than white Americans, like in the 30s. And then the minimum wage was put in specifically to put Black Americans out of work, by the way. It was pushed by white unions, echoes of South Africa, though not as extreme. And so when the unemployment wage was actually an effective unemployment wage, that is, it was below what the market, above what the market rate would have been for like starter wages. That is, it was literally causing unemployment. Then the Black youth unemployment rate really went up. And then inflation would eat away at the legal minimum wage. The inflation rate would go up, and now the minimum wage wasn't really doing anything anymore. And you'd see Black youth working again as much as white youth. And so they'd pass another law, raise the minimum wage, and then you'd see the Black unemployment diverge again, become worse than the white youth unemployment. So it's really a tragic story. And I wish all this stuff about systemic racism would be pointed at something like the minimum wage law, and then I could be all on board with it and say, yeah, let's tear down the minimum wage laws, and
maybe that's an answer, like maybe that is something that needs to be pointed at.
Well, and it's not just that. Go ahead.
Redirection of political aims is a very good strategy into co-opting movements. Perhaps this is something we can get onto with GeoEconomics, but using the energy but just redirecting it towards different focuses is a very good strategy of using the momentum of a movement in order to further your own aims.
Political judo, right?
Yeah, very much so. I've just on the Black issue here in Australia, as people can probably tell, I haven't lived in Australia my whole life, and so I have a little bit of a different insight on this. I think it's the African or Black narrative has been to an extent universalized, especially within the Anglosphere. And that all Blacks, for example, the narrative goes that all Blacks share this experience of slavery and oppression and all this sorts of stuff. I don't think it's true. Certainly, many people did go through that sort of stuff, and we're not denying that that stuff didn't happen. Majority at the hands of the government, but that's another conversation. But I think that. If you constantly have this universal Anglosphere narrative of oppression, you're not willing to even entertain the idea of going into the system to begin with, of even trying to get a job or any of this sort of stuff. So it is incredibly important for young men at a young age to find work. I've mentioned before on the program that I started working at the age of 14. And I think that's incredibly important because idle hands are the devil's workshop. If anyone's heard that phrase before. Yeah. So if you have this frankly idiotic narrative in your head of not even wanting to buy into the system, and you're an idle person until you're the age of 16, and what else are you going to occupy your time with but self-segregation away from the group, which is antisocial behavior, and antisocial behavior is incredibly destructive. And I've seen it all over the world. I've seen all over the world, and it's
in
just
Australia. Do they adapt BLM to the Aboriginals and
yes.
basically say these are the Black lives that matter here, the Aboriginals, and they sort of import that narrative from the United States and just sort of adapt it. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, that is what happened. It's probably a topic for an entirely separate stream, because I do want to get onto our main topic here. But yes, they do. The adaptation, like I said, the global Anglosphere sort of narrative around oppression, especially within minority communities, is quite prevalent. And I don't think it's accurate to every nation's history.
Fun fact, by the way, in Denmark there's no minimum wage, and we don't have this problem of youth unemployment in Denmark.
Yeah, which is really a terrible problem in like France, right, where they have a lot of labor laws. I understand that youth unemployment in France is double digit, has been for the longest time.
Spain is even worse, by the way. Spain, their youth unemployment, I believe, last I checked, was more than 30%.
And this is mostly related to a minimum wage law, or are there other impediments?
Well, minimum wage is a big part of it, yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, it's absolutely insane.
Like 23%, so it's jumped significantly since I last looked a couple of years ago.
It's incredible. And as Mad Merc was pointing out, not only is it, just unjust, right, that you're literally making it illegal for newer, less skilled workers to get a job because they're just not worth that much, and so they just are not able to get on the bottom rung of the ladder, to use the old analogy. So not only is that unjust and terrible, but it's something that has a ripple effect into the future, because each young man that isn't working at 14 or 16. Oh yeah, sorry. I have to, Mathias, throw in not only against the minimum wage law, but against the child labor laws. That's a sort of a hobby horse of mine. I'm a great believer that young people ought to start working at a young age. Doesn't mean I think every 12-year-old should be down in a coal factory, but I think they should have the opportunity to make some money and not have people not literally have people, and this has happened in the United States, Mathias, not literally have people shutting down lemonade stands. And I'm not kidding. This has happened. Bureaucrats and busybodies. I
worked since I was 11.
So you started at 11?
Yeah, I've had a job since I was 11, only with like a few months of gap once in a while, But apart from that, I've always had a job.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on from this.
For those who are becoming parents, or who have young kids who are going to grow up, getting the industrious spirit into a young person is incredibly important. And in those developmental years, especially 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, to get that attitude into them of hard work and what was usually described in the past as the, quote, Protestant work ethic, unquote, is incredibly important.
I think it's the same kind of thing. I don't know if you have this saying in English, actually, but in Denmark, we have this saying that, the shape that you're in when you're 15 is the shape that you keep for the rest of your life. And I think it's much the same thing with work discipline. If you don't have it instilled in you by the time that you're becoming an adult, then you're never going to have it.
I wish I had a more accessible book to share, but I'm just going to throw a link in just because the title's so direct. Walter Williams, great economist at George Mason, head of the department for many years, wrote a book called The State Against Blacks, where he focused on this sort of thing, like minimum wage laws and other impediments. There's more that are the kinds of impediments that, shall we say, the left-wingers tend to not only realize are causing a problem for the people they supposedly champion, but they're often the ones who are championing these measures, right? In the United States, the Democrats would be the ones really pushing for minimum wage laws and many others of the things that Walter Williams identifies in this book. Unfortunately, if you actually click on the link, you'll discover that it can't be had except for like $800. It's really out of print. So yeah, I better make sure I've still got my copy and put it in plastic or something, for if I'm ever hard up.
the resale value on that's
not
going
that
to be.
I'm advocating for it, but there is a certain Russian page that probably.
Yeah, I hope there's a copy of it, just so that it can be read. It's been out long enough. It's been out long enough that I suspect. Yeah, the third printing was 1982. Don't these things expire someday? Anyway, it's 40 years ago that this thing was published. You'd think we could have the text by now. Anyway, okay, so let's stop that. And Mad Merc, let's bring up our contest. Go ahead.
Alrighty. This one will be much shorter than our last mini, which wasn't really a mini, but anyway. We are running, again, to remind you all, a currency competition. This competition is for our people on Discord. We have a Discord server. Link is in the description of this video. You can join. Lots of great content on there. Lots of great people who will help you out with, understanding economics, understanding the market, different financial trends, business opportunities, investment opportunities. Lots and lots of great information there. Lots of people willing to help you out. There's been lots of discussion, especially within the e-currency discussion channels. But we are running a currency competition in there where we are looking for artists to design the best aesthetically pleasing currency. It can be either notes or coins. Both are acceptable. And the winner of this competition will be decided in a special stream at the end of this year. I believe, Radlib, that is sometime after Christmas, correct?
Yeah, I don't know
Just before the end of the year?
How we'll time it. I will say this. I always take a vacation between Christmas and New Year's Eve. And I certainly have saved up my days to be able to do that this year as well. So, again, have to discuss with the wife because it's a family time. But that might be a good time for us to slip it in, is between Christmas and New Year's. So it'd really literally be right at the end of the year.
Yes, it will be our special end of the year stream, and it will be a much lighthearted stream for all of us just to have a look at all the entries in competition. And the winners of this competition, the one that we decide is the best currency submitted, will get actual silver mailed to them. 100% pure silver mailed to their address. And it is a way for us to say thank you for contributing to the channel, to say thank you for entering into the competition and being involved. And it also is a way to basically stick it to the Fed and say, fuck your inflation.
Thank you.
I believe even Mathias has entered into this competition with his
awesome.
interesting hobby in currency. Yes. If you win this competition, you will be getting pure silver. Yes, that is pure silver. Actually, this is not a joke.
I wanted to ask. I'm hoping we've got some precious metal geeks here between the three of us. I'm not so much one. Gold is sometimes not quite pure, right? Because straight pure gold is pretty soft. So even a gold coin, a classic gold coin, I thought could be kind of like 9.5%. And there's a little bit of something else just so it isn't too soft. Isn't that right?
Yes.
No, I mean, the coins that I have 99.999.
Oh, okay.
You can get
like
coins that are
sovereign,
mixed.
for example. That one is, I think it's 93 or 94 or something.
Okay. And they do something because I assume if it was a coin that was really going to be hand to hand, which in the old days, gold coins could be used that way, right? Mm-hmm. It would have to not be too soft or it would just lose the, what's stamped on it, right? It'd become.
If you did use it hand to hand, it would be something like buying a farm or something because it was worth
gold
quite
is
a lot.
Expensive. Yeah.
Right.
But the majority of gold coins around the world in circulation do have some small percentage of other materials in it just for rigidity. But no, the majority, the majority of a coin is actual gold.
Right. The reason I wanted to bring that up is I don't know about silver. silver doesn't have that softness issue, I assume. And so when you get a silver coin, it really is going to not, it really is just going to be 100 and not have anything mixed in for rigidity, right?
Yeah, but
again,
the softness thing with gold, it's not that soft. I mean,
Okay.
It's the middle.
I see.
It's still middle.
So even 100% gold coin is not going to just,
yeah, no,
you're not going to just put your thumbprint into it easily.
no,
No, it's not like
it's not like it's not like a chocolate coin.
Yeah, you know, actually, because of my son's interest in geology, I actually know about the hardness scale. So I should just look it up on the hardness scale. But I'll actually know what that means. The Mohs scale of hardness. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
It's low. It is really low. Okay, gold and silver are between 2.5 and 3 on the hardness scale. Copper is harder than them. Rock salt and a fingernail is just under gold and silver. So it's pretty soft as metals go.
Yeah, but it's not like you hold it in your hand and it starts bending or something. Right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
it is
it's quite strong.
Yeah.
But again,
okay,
guys,
anyway.
the reason we're on this is because we are running a currency design competition. Notes and coins are either acceptable. We will judge it based on aesthetically pleasing grounds. Special stream at the end of the year. Winner will get some silver mailed to them. Pure silver, 100. You're gonna want to enter into this competition because silver is at an all-time low in value on the silver to gold ratio. So please enter in. We appreciate your support, and let's go on.
All right. So our main topic, I know nothing about. It's called GeoEconomics. What does GeoEconomics even mean, Mathias?
Well, so maybe we should start with what GeoEconomics is not.
Okay.
So firstly, it's not pursuing economic goals over geopolitical goals. It's not economic goals driving geopolitical goals. Mm-hmm. And it's not the use of an economy to fund a military. Mm-hmm. What geoeconomics is the use of economic means by international actors to structurally influence world power distribution or to project power.
Right. Now, am I wrong to start thinking of the term soft power? Because I feel like soft power can mean a lot of things when it's used in like geopolitical discussions, but isn't a component of soft power what we're talking about here, geoeconomics?
Well, you could say that geoeconomics is a part of the soft power component of geopolitics. But within geoeconomics, there's also hard and soft economic power. So an example of hard economic power is things like sanctions, embargoes, withdrawals of investment, or currency and stock manipulation, like very direct action. And soft economic power is things like shaping the behavior of geopolitical actors through incentives and structures and links within like value chains and things like those.
So where does a trade deal fit in? Is this
you're
making a trade deal? Yeah, when you're making a trade deal and you're like, if you want to have free managed trade, right? Managed trade with us, then you've got to do this, this, and this. What would that be? That would be geoeconomics, I guess. But would it be the hard or the soft part of it?
Well, that depends on the terms of the trade deal. But I would say in general, if we're talking about, for example, quote unquote free trade deal, it mostly contains soft elements like giving certain incentives to the other geopolitical actors in the trade deal to do the things that you want them to do. So an example.
Right, yeah, it's usually not so black and white. They'll say, if you do such and such, then we will reduce tariffs or something like that, right?
Right. Or you could take an example like the IMF or the Belt and Road Initiative, where they say, if you support us in a vote in the UN, we're going to give you a loan.
Really? Do they put that? Do they actually write that down? Do they buy UN vote?
That's backroom deals, obviously.
But
that is the sort of stuff that goes on.
A lot of these. So when we're talking about soft and hard, hard power, usually more explicit, it's more directly stated, whereas a soft power is more of an implication or worked out behind the scenes in some cases. Obviously, it's not always. Soft power can obviously just be other things, like for example, like a local content requirement for import of a certain good, which is the incentive to try and use local manufacturing, which we'll get onto as a geoeconomic strategy. But geoeconomics is really about the security of the nation through economic means. Now, many of you in the audience might be questioning, saying, well, doesn't this kind of play into monetarism or Keynesianism, the state manipulation, central banks? Isn't this all of this sort of stuff? I think what we're going to get into is how this kind of interacts with geopolitics and economics, and how the two bleed into each other, and how, yes, there is a rather strong potential that the Keynesianism or monetarism can be the justifying factor for geoeconomic moves. And I think, Mathias,
we can get more
Go
into
ahead.
strategy later. There's multiple different geoeconomic strategies, right? But
yes.
I mean, one of the things I also want to make clear is that it's not just states that play in the geoeconomic space. Neither is it just states that play in the geopolitical space. Private actors also act in this space.
Right.
And I think something important to understand about geoeconomics and why it's become so important is, are you familiar with the term fourth generation geopolitics or fourth generation warfare?
I know fourth generation warfare. I read quite a bit on LRC from a fellow whose name I've lost again, but he's I think he kind of wrote the book on it, and I would read columns by him talking about 4G, which to some degree, I mean, obviously you're going to get into aspects of it that I don't remember, but what I recall was part of fourth generation warfare is sort of further evolving away from, large army clashing with large army, right? That's sort of our picture of classic warfare. Yeah. Running across the battlefield at each other with these huge lines against each other. Fourth generation warfare might look more like someone who is dressed as a civilian, planting a bomb near your military installation. William Lend. Thank you, Charlemagne. William Lend is the name I was looking for.
Yeah, I mean,
but you're saying it can go beyond what we would think of as what do you call it? I keep wanting to use the word terrorist because that's what the U.S. empire calls it, but that's not what I mean. No, I just mean the irregular warfare is, I think, one way they refer to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with fourth generation warfare and also fourth generation geopolitics is that it's the idea that modern war can be won off of the field. Like, before you even field soldiers, you can already have won by default. And you do this by disrupting what's called the meta dimensions of modern warfare, which is things like communication, international law, propaganda and media, legitimacy, and like the reason that a country declares war. And an example of this is the conflict in Crimea, for example, where Russia basically won through propaganda, speed, legal procedure, and uncertainty. How they did this was basically by exploiting some of the characteristics of liberal democracy, where a liberal democracy really needs the support of the people to go to war, especially when it's a big war like against Russia. And when they use propaganda and international law and the speed that they went into Crimea in the way that they do, we didn't have the ability to create a justification to enter that war before they had already won. And this is, this is the geopolitical equivalent, right? But you can also do the same thing on a geoeconomic level. We have to go through some basic theory first before you can really get deeply into exactly how you would do that.
Okay, I had a clarifying question on something earlier before you go further, if I may.
Yeah.
You brought up sanctions. Now, for me, sanctions go beyond start to go into what I would just think of as potentially just warfare. Now, I guess part of it has to do with how you do it, right? I mean, at its most extreme, sanctions end up being what I would think of as essentially laying siege to a country. The same way you'd surround a castle and not allow them to get food. Something like this was done to Iraq back before the invasion of Iraq, where they were not able to bring medicine into the country and so forth.
Right.
And so at that point, the line between, because I don't think by geoeconomics you mean just outright acts of war. It's sort of things that might be leading up to acts of war, but don't quite cross the line. Am I right about that, Mathias?
Well, you could think of geoeconomics as a sub-discipline of geopolitics. And there's definitely interrelations between the two. And there are some of the actions, like, for example, embargoes, that one in the old sense would maybe think of directly as an act of war, like blockading a port, for example, and refusing ships both entry and exit. That would traditionally probably be thought of as an act of war, right? But like an example of something that's not necessarily an act of war is like US has control over the Panama Canal to a very big degree, right? And if you start refusing, for example, North Korean ships from passing through the Panama Canal, or Iranian ships, or whatever, that's not necessarily an act of war. You're asking for access to foreign waters. It's not your own waters that this is taking place in. And it's merchant vessels. So it's not, I don't think it actually crosses into war. And the reason that this is now a thing that really can actually beat a country in the geopolitical arena is because trade has become so incredibly important, because the economy has become so incredibly important to the ruling elite for them to keep power in their nations.
Yeah, it's incredibly important to keep trade going especially for any sort of developed or developing economy, and denying access to even entry into markets, the use of certain facilities, like Mathias was saying, like the Suez or Panama Canal. It can be incredibly destructive and disruptive to a nation's ability to trade and to access markets. So, for example, I might be jumping the gun here, Mathias, so stop me at any point. But if, for example, a nation doesn't conform to the U.S.'s trade standards, as we saw during the beginning of President Trump's tenure, that he was renegotiating, quote unquote, renegotiating trade deals for more favorable degrees to the United States. If these nations don't renegotiate to the U.S. terms, the U.S. could deny them access to U.S. markets, and that would be devastating for a lot of people. So just the act of denial to a country, the initial defensive move, can actually be an offensive strategy. So simply denying access is actually an attack, an indirect attack on that other nation's economic abilities. So we'll get into strategy and fundamentals in just a second, but people have to understand that this is just because someone is necessarily doing a short-term defensive move or a short-term offensive move doesn't mean that in the long term it is either offensive or defensive. It can be the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, there are strategies that that are, for example, short-term defensive and long-term offensive, or long-term offensive and short-term defensive, and so on. We will get into a couple of examples of geoeconomic strategies towards the end.
Right. So, Mathias, do you want to get us started on some fundamentals so we can explain for everyone so we're all on the same page?
Sure. So I guess where I'll start is just to explain why it is that geoeconomics is becoming more prevalent. And there's three primary reasons. The first.
Wait, I'm sorry. When you say more prevalent, are you talking about more prevalent in that people are talking about it, or you mean more prevalent that nations are, well, not just nations, you said private actors as well, but that states and private actors are doing it more than in the past?
Yeah, I mean more compared to conventional warfare. So instead of direct physical conflict, they're using geoeconomic means to lead war.
I see. War by other means. Got it.
Right. So in the past, so to give an example, in the past, to intimidate a nation, you, especially a much weaker nation than like a Britain or a France, let's say they're going to Ethiopia, or rather Siam or some other nation, they would do something called gunboat diplomacy, which is sailing a bunch of ships up a river and saying, "Hi, how you doing? Let's have a chat while I have a big ass ship with a bunch of guns and a bunch of angry Marines on it." So that's how it used to be in the past, with very direct, very clear action of you will do as we say or else. Whereas today it's a lot more, as Mathias was saying, geoeconomics is a tool within the geopolitical toolbox, and you have soft power and hard power, and it's a lot less direct. There's more things to play with rather than just a simple
Mathias?
Here we are.
Are you familiar, Mathias, with this fellow who wrote, I think it was called Economic Hitman?
No.
Okay. There was a fellow who basically, he viewed himself as a whistleblower, I guess. And he said, I would be sent by the United States to some small Latin American country or whatever, and I would give them an offer they couldn't refuse. But it was more along the lines of geoeconomics, I think.
Okay.
Rather than like, I'm going to shoot you, it was more like, boy, it'd be a shame if something happened to that nice economy you have there.
Yeah, because you don't have to actually send in the army to depose a ruling elite. All you have to do is make their people do it for you. And there is no more expedient 100%. Way of doing that than making sure that, for example, family fathers are starting to get worried about feeding their children.
I found it. It's John Perkins. He wrote a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It came out 15 years ago. I'll share the link to that. Anyway, I wonder if this is close or exactly the sort of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean that would be what I would consider hard economic actions, or hard geoeconomic actions, rather than soft.
Right.
Like the soft ones are more like enticing to do something rather than actually threatening to do something.
Right.
Soft is correction. Hard is a direct use of very clear action, whereas soft changes the incentive structures for your ends. I think is a good way of putting it.
Yeah, exactly. And then just to get back to the thing I was saying, if I may. So there's three reasons that this is getting more prevalent in warfare now. The first one being that modern war has a much higher cost than conventional war used to have. The second one is that the economy has become increasingly more important for the ruling elites to stay in power. And again, this is in particular an issue for liberal democracies. And this is one of the things that, for example, Russia exploited in the Crimea conflict. And then 3, power is no longer limited to the control of geopolitical territories, but also of key industries, and in particular, both digital industries, which are highly ephemeral, but also supply chains and value chains and ecosystems. And by value chains and ecosystems and supply chains, what I'm talking about is, the Austrian saying with the more advanced economies producing goods in a more roundabout way. And this is what a value chain is, right? You have somebody who mines something, you have somebody who refines it, you have someone who makes nuts and bolts, then you have somebody who assembles that into basic components, you have someone who manufactures the advanced components, and then eventually you have somebody with a lot of know-how that puts all of this together into a product.
And in particular, in current circumstances, we find that as you go through those stages, from mining something out of the ground, eventually all the way to something being on the shelves for someone to buy, things are actually moving around the globe, right? Yeah. Those stages might be all over the world. It might be bouncing all over the world, and they're literally shipping, a half-finished thing from one country to another so it can go through the next stage before it goes from there to somewhere else, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but Boeing, for example, is a good example of this. They have, thousands of subcontractors just to manufacture one of their airplanes, right? Right. They're all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the one of the key elements of geoeconomics is the understanding that with specialization, as the supply chain becomes longer and it encompasses more countries around the world, these are also not these areas where they interact with different countries may not necessarily be failure points, but they are areas of the supply chain that can be targeted by either your own nation or by other nations for your own geopolitical aims. Yes, and this is
really
what we're
do a
talking
lot
about.
of damage to a geopolitical strategy by, for example, attacking the supply chain of Boeing. So that's the point.
But as we said, because it's so ultimately decentralized, right? I mean, they'll for security reasons, as they're building a military plane, certain things will be really under tight controls, but those are kind of probably at the later stages, right? Or maybe in regards to the software on board software or something like that, right? Which, by the way, is done.
But there are even basic things. For an example would be coltan, for example, which is the main place that you get coltan from is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and there's basically, there are other places that you can get coltan from, but this mineral is most prevalent in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and so attacking that particular rare earth resource can actually do significant harm to a value chain that relies on that resource, even though it's very basic.
Right.
So, this is maybe also a good time to get into one of the characteristics here, which is that, it's basically the importance of industries. Like there's 2 industry characteristics that are really important in geoeconomics. There is the profitability, which is very obvious. You need lots of money to be able to fund a geopolitical strategy, right? And then there's the geopolitical significance of these different industries. And there are both, in these 2 instances, there's both highly profitable industries and there is quite unprofitable industries. And then there is geopolitically insignificant and geopolitically significant industries. And there is mixes between all of these 4 instances, right? So you have highly profitable industries that are geoeconomically insignificant. An example of that would be superhero movies, for example, right? Like they don't really matter to geopolitics, but they're highly profitable. And number two would be an industry that's highly profitable and also very geoeconomically significant. An example of that would be oil or finance or things like this. And then you get into the unprofitable ones, which you have ones that are insignificant, which would be like tie-dye T-shirts or something, like not particularly important for a geopolitical strategy and not particularly profitable. And then you get into the last one, which is like things that are pretty unprofitable, but very geoeconomically significant. And a good example of that is like rare earths. Like coltan would be one example of that. There's not very much profit in mining coltan.
Why isn't it profitable if it's so needed?
Because there's lots of it. I mean, there's way more coltan than there's demand.
And I'm sorry, could you spell that word? I'm not hearing what you're saying there.
Coltan, Coltan.
I have never heard of this in my life.
Well, the rare earth you get from it is tantalum.
Okay.
It's used in many different things. It's quite important.
Huh. Learned something new. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. So when you go beyond this as well, then like a point to make on this is geopolitically significant industries must be available to your economy in case of a geopolitical conflict. If you don't have these very significant industries available to you, then you risk losing by default, right? In the same way that you risk losing by default, for example, if your communication is cut off, or if your liberal democracy and propaganda is successful at like convincing your populace that it's not rightful for you to go to war, you can lose by default if you lose access to some of these resources or industries.
I just wanted to bring up an example that's near and dear to the heart of the old right, one might say, Mathias, and that is the entry of the United States into World War II. And the story in brief, as I've learned it from revisionists, is that FDR, for various reasons, wanted to get involved in the European war, and he tried to bait the Germans into blowing up a U.S. ship or something like that, and they were too smart and wouldn't do it. So he went through what's called the back door to war. That is the war with Japan, because Japan and Germany were allied. So if he could get a war going with Japan, then he could get his war in Europe, which is what he really wanted. And so what he did, and I guess this would be pretty hard on the scale of geoeconomic measures, is that he secretly, that is without the U.S. public knowing it, was blockading Japan from getting access to oil, which was, of course, a key resource for them and one that they did not have natively in Japan. So it was a real vulnerability for them, well, for what they were doing imperialistically, but just for them to function as an economy, right? So he cut off their oil and thus Pearl Harbor. But of course, he presented Pearl Harbor as if it came from nowhere, and why would they ever do that? I can't imagine. Those dastardly Japs. So anyway, that to me just seems like one of the most infamous examples of playing geoeconomics. In this case, hard geoeconomics, but secretly doing it under the table.
Yeah, and this actually gets into something quite interesting. I find that the geoeconomists realize, but like Austrian economists don't necessarily realize. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily an argument against free market capitalism, but it is something to consider. So you're familiar with David Ricardo's absolute and comparative advantage, right?
I think so. Yes. Yeah.
it's just the idea that
Mises talks about it as the law of association, I think. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in basic terms, it's just the idea that when two countries trade with each other, they're both going to benefit by focusing on what they're best at producing, even if one of the countries is worse at producing all things than the other country. Like they're going to end up with more resources if they cooperate and trade.
Right.
However, you also have to consider the long-term consequences of this. And an example would be, let's take Britain, for example, and Portugal. And let's say that Portugal is better at producing wine and Britain is better at producing cloth. According to David Ricardo, it would make sense for Portugal to produce wine and Britain to produce cloth. But if you consider the long-term consequences of this, wine production does not lead to the same level of industrialization as cloth production does. And that has long-term effects on the economy, right? And on top of that, there's also derivative industries that are developed because of cloth production that would not be developed under wine production. Things like production of dyes, chemicals, a design industry, things like this. This is why an industry like the cloth industry is considered a gateway industry for for the industrialization of an economy. And I think there's an extremely important point that's often overlooked by free market economists and it as I said, it's not necessarily an argument against free market economics, because obviously private actors would also see this. But if you have a state that is prioritizing wine production and subsidizing it or whatever, you can actually end up putting yourself in a weaker geoeconomic position by doing this. And there's also then the risk, because Britain then, because they industrialize, their economy grows much faster than the Portuguese one. And now you get into risks like Britain starting to acquire key industries in Portugal. So they'll start acquiring, firms that are important to the Portuguese geoeconomic strategy. And at that point, if you've lost control over the firms that are critical to your geoeconomic strategy, then you've lost by default, in the same way that you'd lose by default if you lose the propaganda war in Crimea, for example.
So this sounds a little bit like, going back to your point about the extra beneficial effects of having certain industries. It kind of sounds like a sort of like a positive externality, if you follow me. You're saying that if England
compounds, right?
Yeah, England makes cloth. Of course, they make cloth and they're able to trade it, and there's just the benefits of making cloth. But the process of making cloth puts certain things in place in the economy that then benefit other kinds of processes, right? So it's sort of you get bonus on top of just the cloth that's produced.
Yes, even if you make less money actually making the cloth than making wine. It's the long-term benefit we're talking about here.
Right, and this comes down to comes back to an idea of being strategically dependent upon certain resources. So, for example, if we go back, many people have, to use a real-world example, many people, will remember if we go back to our China or Japan streams, they will remember us saying that these countries are in relative terms, resource poor. In relative terms, not absolute, but relative. Therefore, they have to import a lot of raw materials. They have to import a lot of stuff from certain industries, especially in early days of China and Japan, where they were free industrial societies. This made them dependent on certain nations and them having the goodwill of certain nations. Now, they tried to rectify this by, especially Japan early on, tried to rectify this by industrializing and having certain industries within the nation so that they are no longer dependent upon the goodwill of other nations. They brought the process in-house to secure the resource, to secure the economic means of generating these finished products and materials and this sort of stuff. And this is what we're talking about. This is what Mathias is saying, is that yes, you could specialize. Yes, it's more economically profitable. Yes, in every sort of purely economic sense, it's good to specialize in what you do and let other people specialize in what they do. But this specialization requires trust, and it requires that no one takes advantage of the fact that you may not have a certain industry or a certain good. And unfortunately, we live in a reality where we can't trust everyone, and not everyone is an honest actor.
Right. Yeah.
So
it is something that you have to consider, and as I said, this is of importance for national defense, right? So it's a serious concern when you have a country that's reliant on other countries.
100%. And so, for example, to give a real world example again, when a lot of industry from the United States was being offshored to places like India, China, Vietnam, and Japan, many people saw this as not only bad because workers were losing jobs, although we can debate that. They also saw this as bad for national security. So, for example, if an argument is that if we lose GM, we would also lose the military contracts that they were upholding and the technology that they had. Or, for example, if we offshore, a big debate at the moment with the pandemic that's going around the world is the pharmaceutical industry, and how much of that is processed and made in foreign countries and not within domestic Western countries. So we are now vulnerable when this black swan event of a pandemic goes across the earth to the goodwill of these foreign nations delivering on a vaccine or medical supplies. And you've seen this huge rush in domestic production from Western firms in the creation of stuff like face masks or temperature gear. So I
believe actually you had an example of the face mask problem in Australia where China seized large shipments of masks that were going to Australia.
Yes, I was actually literally about to come on to that. And these industries can actually be held hostage to a dependent nation. So in Austrian economics and in normal economics, we would say specialization, absolutely 100% good. Everyone trade, free trade, immigration, that sort of stuff. But in the reality, when you don't have honest actors, when you have states who have their own geopolitical goals, you can be held hostage if you specialize too much, if you lose an industry too much. And we need to be very careful in the real world.
I follow the story you're telling. I think it makes sense. But one thing that is confusing to me is, as we know, the interdependency and the decentralization, as we discussed with the stages of production, everything is quite immense, right? Some people call it globalization, right?
Yeah.
I think people mean a lot of different things by globalization, but one of them refers to the production process being extremely international. You know, that just about anything that is at all interesting beyond like a bare piece of raw material, any manufactured good, you know, an iPhone, even a pencil, as Leonard Reed famously talked about, is going to be produced internationally. There's bits and pieces and parts of the process and tools used in the process and so forth that are from all over the place. So why is it seems like if anyone wants to play this game, the other side can play it too, right? Because, you know, it's not like there's some countries that are just sitting there dependent on everybody and don't have anything to offer. I mean, it's pretty much a two-way street. Otherwise, they'd just be an isolated autarky, right? So if you're going to withhold mass from me, then I'm going to withhold, you know, whatever, iPhones from you or whatever it is, you know?
Right.
Like how did you follow me? Like, why are these threats ever realizable? Because somebody could just always say, well, I'm going to play that game with you too, tit for tat. And then eventually you're like, okay, maybe we should stop playing this game, right?
Right. And now we're getting into now we have the basis, right? Now we understand what the core issue of geoeconomics is and why it is that the countries are thinking about geoeconomics and acting on it. But so now we're getting into the strategy of how exactly are you going to actually use this for something? And there is two sort of examples I want to bring up here. The first one being what people traditionally think of when they think of America, and the second one being what they think of when they think of command economy. And I'll term this the liberal strategy for America and the developmentalist strategy for the command economy. And just to be clear, there is no country on earth that is entirely one or the other. America also uses developmentalism to a large degree, and China also uses liberalism to a large degree. But these are just the archetypes, right? It's like the outer extremes of geoeconomics. The liberal strategy is basically to prioritize the efficiency of the internal market through a high level of competition between is what's considered like a long-term offensive and short-term defensive strategy. It creates really strong firms, and the weakness of it is that there's not really any direction. And by direction, what I'm referring to is like there's basically three overarching means to manipulate geoeconomic factors. The first one is regulations and international law. The second one is financial, which is like control of market access, banking, investment access, things like that. And the last one is directional. And that's basically manipulating through, for example, subsidies, which industries get funding. They do this sort of thing, for example, with Boeing and all of these companies that are important to the military industrial complex and so on. Also subsidizing energy production and whatever else. So the problem with a full-on liberal strategy is that you don't really have that direction, which means that you can end up with your economic sphere not containing one of the resources or industries that are key to your geoeconomic strategy. And then there's the developmentalist strategy, which is the other side of this, which is like building up national champions. So, for example, in China, they have 3 companies that are building up mobile networks, and 3 companies that are building up energy, like energy grids, and like they have these national champions that they elevate to high positions and focus on having the things that are important to their geoeconomic goals, having those within the control of their economic sphere. And obviously, they're now expanding it through the Belt and Road Initiative to try and get access to more and more things that they don't necessarily have inside of China.
I'm just jump in real quick because I'm learning as we're going here. National champions is in Wikipedia. This is a recognized term. Corporations which are technically private businesses, but due to governmental policy are ceded a dominant position in a national economy. They're expected not only to seek profit, but also to advance the interests of the nation. Yes. And the government sets policies which favors these organizations.
Yes.
Okay.
Right. This sort of strategy was really, especially in the early years of kind of geoeconomic thought, was really pioneered by the French. So if you have a look at the French use these national champions to an insane degree. These national champions not only engage in geoeconomic goals of a certain nation, but they can also engage in, for example, technology stealing. They can operate as almost intelligence wings of a nation through private sort of backroom deals. So you have to understand that these are private companies, but they also to a certain extent, are entities of the state.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I follow. And I guess what I'm being reminded of the infant industries strategy, if you've heard about that.
Right.
And again, it's a state favoring a certain industry, a certain company or whatever, or a set of companies. And of course, the big problem
that comes back to the cloth industry example, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a big problem with the infant industries approach, as we see in economic history, is that it produces weak companies. Because
right, and that was what I was getting to. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the downside of the developmentalist strategy is exactly that. It creates weaker firms than the highly competitive liberal strategy. But right. The benefit, obviously, is that it creates highly directed industries inside of your geoeconomic sphere. And so the reality, of course, is that either of these strategies are probably not ideal, right? Like both of those really bad drawbacks, like no direction and having really weak firms, both of those drawbacks are really fatal to a geoeconomic strategy. So you need to strike a balance between these in some way. And I mean, we understand how nations do this, but really the reason I wanted to get on this stream with you, Radlib, is because, you know, we are pretty close politically, I think. And I find it quite interesting to think about how private law societies would even deal with this. And I think I have some ideas for how to deal with it, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Well, it sounds to me, let me make sure I'm not oversimplifying. It sounds to me that the driving concern here is, you could call it a security concern, right? Regardless of whether you're a nation state or you're a private law society, whatever, you have security concerns. And the question is how to deal with security. Now, the traditional answer, which, you know, anarcho-capitalist question, the traditional answer is that, well, that's what the state is there for, and the state is going to make awesome decisions and keep the nation secure by its awesome decisions about how to equip the military and which industries to protect and which things to keep secret. I'm of course remembering the encryption. I had dealt with this as a software engineer. Yeah. I couldn't send certain things to people in other countries because they had encryption algorithms that were considered like a United States security asset or something. It all seems a little silly now when everybody's using much stronger encryption than back in those days. But anyway, so the whole idea is the state is going to make these smart decisions that are going to redound to the security of the nation or whatever, right? Anarcho-capitalists question this, and they say, you know, just like anything else that the state does, it's going to do a bad job of security provision. And a better job could be done with competitive forces at play, right? So that's sort of the high-level textbook answer to what we're talking about, which is that the state is actually at a disadvantage from an economic point of view because it is a protected industry, you could say, right? It's a protected security industry. And so it doesn't have to compete. And when it does a bad job, like speaking from the United States perspective, gets us involved in conflicts that are unending and just seem to be completely irrelevant to anything, right? Like 19 years of Afghanistan or whatever. And we're just, regular Americans are like, why are we still there? What is going on? It just makes no sense to us, right? And so we view that as a failure of the state in regards to security. But we can't fire the United States federal government. And in fact, even when we get a guy in office who starts talking like he's going to be non-interventionist, we get 4 more years of war in Afghanistan regardless, right? So that's the problem with the state as a monopoly provider of security, is that you get, you know, higher cost, lower quality. I'm just giving textbook economic problem with monopoly, right? Higher cost, lower quality, and you can't fire them when they when you get sick of the bad quality of it, right? And so the idea of a private law society is that we ought to be able to have competition even in this, even in terms of security provision, and even what you're talking about, sort of strategizing about how to best provide security. Security. Let's imagine that it's, Hoppe likes to talk about insurance companies, right? Let's imagine that a number of us are paying insurance to, and the insurance will have to pay out in the case of invasion from that nasty state that's next door, right? We know they're a classic monopoly state, and we know what they're like, and so we're afraid that they're going to come and invade our property. So we buy insurance for protection from Moravia or whatever, and so then the insurance company now has these funds coming in, and they don't want to pay out. They don't want to have an invasion happen and have to pay everybody for being bombed or whatever. So they try various strategies to defend us from Moravia. And maybe they include these geoeconomic kind of things, right? They try to make it in Moravia's interest to not attack through geoeconomic mechanisms. And maybe they even go further and they make sure they spend some money, the insurance company spends some money on ensuring that we have access to certain resources that we would need to defend ourselves from them, right? And then another insurance company comes along and says, wow, they're spending way too much trying to get a hold of coltan or whatever it was. And we think we can provide security cheaper by not doing some of the crazy strategies they're doing. I mean, am I sort of outlining the game here, Mathias, correctly?
Yes, but I think so let's take an example of a world where there is one superpower called, let's call it the People's Republic of the United States.
Right.
They have like they're the only superpower in the world, and their economic sphere basically is supreme. And they have the ability to sanction or embargo us and block us from trading with anybody they feel like. And we need things from, like, let's say that we live in this, I don't know if you read about Prospera, for example, in Honduras. It's like a small private city project.
Okay.
Let's say we live there, and we have food and things like that, but we also need, things for producing electronics, or we need raw resources for producing weapons to defend ourselves. We need to import, X, Y, Z, all kinds of things, right? Machinery, whatever. In that world, I don't believe it's possible for a private law society to exist. And I think this is fundamentally the reason why the age of the city-state disappeared in Europe. Because it got to a point where city-states had no choice but to join one of these nation-states that dominated. And this is why I think it's quite interesting, this change that's happening, where actually it was technically possible during the Cold War to have these small city-states. That's also why so many countries ended up going, some shade of communist, because they actually had the ability to exist. The non-aligned nations really allowed a lot of trade outside of the economic spheres of both the USSR and the US. And this is sort of happening again, with China and Russia and the United States. And I think that's why I'm quite optimistic about the prospect for city-states to exist again. Because
you are optimistic because
Yes.
why? because I mean we are in the okay. Let me lay out. I'm going to borrow from Caitlin Johnston because I know Mad Mercenary loves it when I do this so much. She talks about the let's see, like you talked about city states being absorbed into nation states. She has this picture of the U.S. I forget what she calls it, like the imperial blob or whatever, you know, that basically you have countries that are very much tied to the United States and kind of do the United States bidding. Australia would be a good example of this, right? When the U.S. says jump, Australia says how high, in essence. So even though formally on paper and at the United Nations and all that, Australia is considered independent from the United States, effectively it's been absorbed in the way the city-states were absorbed into the nation-states in a de facto way, if not a de jure way, right? And so then what you end up with right now is a world where you're either part of the U.S., whatever you want to call it, larger United, so to speak, or the imperial U.S. You're either part of that, or you're not, and the U.S. is usually coming down on you. The U.S. allies is coming down on you to try to get you to be absorbed into that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think this is what Mathias is talking about, and if I'll jump in here, there's a fundamental shift that I think is happening in the world at the moment, where I believe that the United States is pulling back, because ultimately the Cold War is over, and there's no longer a real need to have the world hegemon as it is anymore. Now, it's taken a little bit to get this idea through. Obviously, old ideas die hard, but ultimately, there's no reason for the United States to be this world hegemon anymore. And I think what you're seeing is the United States focusing more internally. And as it focuses more internally, new spheres open up, new spheres of, economic power and political power and, geographic regions. Like, for example, I think before the show, we were talking about Eurasia, or the Southeast Asian sort of sphere, which way it's going to go. And so within that sort of world where there are multiple powers and it's more dynamic, it's not a single hegemon, smaller states have the ability to maneuver in this sort of environment a lot better than what they would with dealing with a single actor who holds all the power. Think about it from a negotiation standpoint. If a single party holds all the power, you are at the behest of that party. But if you have alternatives, exactly like a monopoly, if you have alternatives, those alternatives have to be more competitive in order to buy your money, your vote. And it's the exact same thing with smaller nations in bigger spheres of influence. Now, this is assuming obviously where they're located in the world and how they're interacting in a relationship that they would have with different larger spheres. But it gives a bit more wiggle room. There's more dynamicism.
Yeah,
right.
so
I
put it into Austrian terms, what we're talking about here is that there's no longer going to be a monopoly on economic spheres. There's going to be competition in economic spheres.
Right.
On a global level.
And I used this, I think, before, Mathias, when we were on UO, Unpopular Opinions together, I think. But I'll just mention again, Ralph Raico, one of the first things I remember going to the Mises Institute and him lecturing on the rise of liberty in Europe. And he said, why did we get liberty in Europe? Because the Roman Empire never was able to be reconstituted, despite many attempts, right, by Napoleon and many others. We never got a Europe-spanning power that became sort of the monopoly in Europe. Instead, there were originally in the Middle Ages many little city-states and bishoprics and principalities and so forth. But even later, still, there was never one dominating power, even as it started to congeal into nation states. And so someone who was, a savvy businessman and was bringing a lot of money in because of his good business, if the taxes started getting high, he would literally just move, right? He would move from France to Germany or whatever. And we certainly had people like this. If the business climate got bad, they would just leave. And so there was a incentive for the states to not make the business climate so terrible, in essence.
Yeah.
And out of that, he argued, arose what we think of as liberty. Classical.
And one of the things that, historically, the economic spheres, like the reach of a nation was quite quite short. Take Genoa, for example. They traded inside of the Mediterranean and a little bit up the Spanish, Portuguese, and French coasts, and that was basically the extent of their economic reach, and that's why when Europe coalesced into these large powers, like France, for example, becoming one large power, and the Habsburgs taking control over Spain and the lowlands and all of that, right? That basically forced city-states to pick a side, because they didn't have the ability to have diverse trade anymore. And this is the case because they had such a short reach. But in the modern world, we have basically global reach. So we don't need as many operators of economic spheres anymore to have diversity. And in particular,
Right.
the non-aligned nations, the reason that they haven't really had economic power to offer to city-states yet is because the US won the Cold War, and they are the only economic sphere. But once you have China, and then later, I also believe Russia is going to become its own economic sphere because of the northern shipping routes opening up most of the year.
Okay.
And Europe then is also going to start pulling away from the US, in particular because Germany is very reliant on Russian gas. They're going to sort of sit in between and get concessions from Russia. Especially because Britain has pulled out of the EU now, right? So they're aligned with the Anglo nations. That cuts the last tie, really, that the EU had with the Anglosphere. So that means we end up with a world where we have four major, like what I would call major or great powers, which is the US or the Anglosphere, including Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and so on.
Yeah.
South Africa as well, for that matter. And then we have the EU, and we have Russia, and we have China, and then the non-aligned nations, which still exist to this day. I don't know if you're familiar with non-aligned nations, the thing that was started by Josip Tito of Yugoslavia.
It wasn't just a term that geopoll watchers used, wasn't it? Didn't they actually?
It's an actual organization. It still exists.
An organization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it still exists, and it has. It has a lot of members. Actually, I can send a picture here of the.
Oh, you can share
map.
it. If you have it up, share it with StreamYard, and I'll put it up. Just hit your screen.
I've sent it in the Discord in the show organization room.
Okay, I can bring it up.
Just to be clear, before we move on, I happen to disagree with Mathias on this point of how this is all breaking down. Mathias, I believe you're more talking about this Eurasianist idea about how the vertical way of how the world breaks down. I tend to believe it's going to break down a different way, but the fundamental underlying point is that we do believe is that the world is going to break down into different economic and political spheres, which allows for more dynamism, however you say the word. Sorry, with neutral nations. There's a lot of opportunity there to play between the gaps. Again, depending on where you are, how close you are to these dominant spheres of influence, and this sort of thing. But it's all based upon the idea of securing resources, securing those industries, making sure you're not vulnerable in a world without a global hegemon. And this is where, again, the economic aspect comes back into it.
Yeah.
I've got that map up now, Matthias. It is quite striking. All of the ones that are not gray are, it says they're colored by date joined or whatever, but all the ones that are not gray that have a color on this map are actually part of this non-aligned outfit, right? Well, this is not trivial. I mean, India, you didn't list it as one of the possible centers of, of an economic zone or whatever, but India is no joke, right? I mean, it's got a lot of people, and it was pretty mired for some time in protectionism and so forth. But decades ago that they got out of that.
Yeah, and I mean, on this map, by the way, the observers are not even colored on this map. Amongst the observers, you have countries like Argentina, China, Kazakhstan, Paraguay, Uruguay, Armenia, Costa Rica, Kyrgyzstan, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, Mexico, Tajikistan, Brazil, El Salvador, Montenegro, and Ukraine. Those are observer countries. So they're not colored in, but they're also, I mean, not directly a part of it, but they are observing.
They're adjacent in some sense.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, as I look at this, I guess, back when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, you'd look at this map and go, yeah, whatever. These are insignificant. Economically speaking, they're insignificant, right? But the world is changing, and the developing world is developing, right? And so actually, I look at this map and I go, maybe not now, but soon enough, these folks can be their own.
Yeah, and I mean,
zone, right?
Look at Africa, right? Like, if we're putting together, the Arabian countries, the stans, like Africa and South America, and Southeast Asia, for that matter, Malaysia and Indonesia. We're talking about more than half of the human population that are going to be living in this area in the next few decades, right?
Right. And a lot of natural resources in those parts of the map, right? So even if they don't have all the developed industry that is in the other parts of the world, they have a chokehold on certain natural resources, right?
Yes. And this is a huge opportunity,
this comes
right?
Right back to the economic aspect that we were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and from our perspective as anarcho-capitalist or Hobbesians or whatever, this is a huge opportunity, and this is why I keep telling people we need to start thinking like entrepreneurs, because this is a golden opportunity that we're going to live through.
An opportunity in what sense?
In terms of realizing our political goals.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that there's going to be new spaces in between these contending regional economic blocks or whatever. There'll be room in the spaces to carve out something different. And of course, it just so happens that real liberty, real freedom, real property rights, real free markets are phenomenally productive, right? So if you can carve out a space and get going, it may not take that long before you become a real player, because statist zones are hobbled by the statism, right? I mean, even the United States, which is, has a relatively free internal market and so on and so forth. Even the United States, I mean, talk to us American libertarians. We will give you a laundry list of things that the United States government, federal government, and state governments and so forth are doing to hobble our productivity in the United States. I mean, imagine just one place, a Texas or a California that really had a free market. I mean, it could shoot past the rest of the United States quite quickly.
How many millions of libertarians are there in the US? Right. I mean, in Europe and other countries, South America, there's a lot of anarchists in South America. I basically view, anarcho-capitalist, we tend to be very entrepreneurial, right?
Right.
And in a certain sense, we are the productive elite of society. We have a lot to offer to nations. So projects like Prospera, they start out as free economic zones where what we're offering a nation is essentially that they can have a microcosm that's similar to something like Singapore or Hong Kong in their back garden. And this is, I mean, there's many countries that want that. So we can go out and negotiate for these deals, and then once we build up economic power, this is a lesson that that is repeated throughout history. This is how the people got power in Athens, for example. Their version of democracy was a lot different than what we have now, right? It was only the landowning elite that had a vote. And the way that they got power from the archons was through economic power. So once we build up economic power one of these places, we can get sovereignty.
Right. I think we also have to understand, going back to the root of this conversation, is that you have to pair this economic power with an understanding that so for example, if you're going to set up these independent sort of states, again, I don't agree in the way that you're phrasing it of how it will break down, but I agree that there will be different spheres of influence in the future. But
I'm interested in hearing how you think it would break down, by the way. Just decide
probably probably a different discussion. But anyway, these independent nations have to realize, in an economic terms, that they have to pair their economic growth with a geopolitical strategy. They have to engage in geoeconomics for their own security, because if they don't, they may fall into the same trap and be swallowed up by the spheres of influence because they are dependent upon them. Yes. They give too much leverage to these spheres of influence in a pursuit of economic growth. I would be interested in hearing, Mathias, your theories on how to coordinate that in a PLS, because obviously with it being private, it may be a little bit harder to coordinate actions, especially if it's just on consensus, rather than a top-down approach like a state might.
Well, this is why I'm a Hoppian and not just merely an anarcho-capitalist. I think.
Yeah, please explain why you like to say Hoppian.
Yes, I think that the important thing about the important thing that Hoppe has really elucidated in terms of making an anarcho-capitalist society function is that you need a covenant. There are certain things that cannot be accepted in a private law society if you want to maintain a libertarian social order and if you want to maintain your sovereignty. Some of those things are, you can't have Democrats and communists going around in your community and arguing to take away property rights from landowners or business owners. Right. That's one of the things that you obviously can't have. But what you also can't have is people that are acting against the geopolitical and geoeconomic interests of the private law society. Mm-hmm. And this is why I think this topic, and this is why I brought it to you, this is why I think this topic is so important, because what you really need to make a private law society function is to create a covenant that not only takes into account the things that Hoppe has elucidated in terms of culture and politics, but also takes into account the needs to maintain sovereignty, which are very different now than they were even in the 70s.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, tell me if you think this is a bad analogy, but this is an aspect of Hoppe that I think people who haven't really read him find shocking, right? When he talks about physical removal of people from a community who don't share the values of the community, right? But and he uses the example of, say, in a private property-oriented society, people who are fundamentally opposed to property, like Democrats.
Yes.
And we mean little d Democrats. It's not. We don't just mean big D Democrats. We mean little d Democrats when we say that. that might sound quite shocking, but let me use this analogy if this maybe helps anyone. In the United States, not just the United States, but in the United States, outright racism is like really verboten, right? And I don't mean just in these more politically correct times. And I think part of the reason for that, there's, political correctness and left-wingism and stuff like that. But there's another reason, which is that it is not a homogenous society, and it hasn't been for a long time. And so on some level, whether consciously or not, people realize that if it comes down to, a race war, it's going to tear the country apart. Mm-hmm. So, there's essentially a self-defense mechanism in the society to say, if you're someone who's pushing for a race war, we're going to kind of come down on you pretty hard because our society cannot survive a race war. The United States, it would just be complete chaos, right? Because we are all living right next to each other. It's not like there's, the Hispanic section over here and the black section over there. I mean, we're just neighbors with each other. So it would just be total chaos. It wouldn't be secession. It'd be just brother against brother almost, So in a likewise manner, in a private law society, a private property-based society, it's like that. It would whether in terms of covenant legally or whether just sort of the culture and the society or both, there would have to be a acknowledgement that we cannot function without private property being sacrosanct. And if you do not hold it as sacrosanct, you are a threat to the cohesion of our society in the same way that outright, race war. I always like to use the example of the killer. I'm sorry. Why do I keep forgetting his name? Helter Skelter guy. You know who I mean? Charles Manson. Charles Manson did these commanded these horrible murders because he wanted to get a race war going, right? Well, if you're a Charles Manson, you're a danger to the United States, right? Well, in the same way, the Charles Manson of a private law society is someone who agitates against private property. Yeah. Right.
And the reason that the covenant is very important, and I believe that the covenant has to be tied to the deeds that grant you ownership over land in a private law society. The reason that they're so important is because fundamentally Hoppians believe that private property rights stem from body ownership and the original appropriation of property. And once somebody owns private property, if there is no agreement about certain things you can't do, you can't remove that person morally. And so the covenant is important to grant people the moral permission to remove somebody who breaks the covenant.
Yeah, so I think just to catch everybody up, because I think you're deeper into this than I am, to catch everybody up, you're not just speculating. I mean, people are trying this to a small degree here and there, and they are writing these covenants, and they are thinking about what should be in them, right? I mean, this is a going concern, right, Matthias? Yeah. And so this is quite different than, say, the many commune experiments that have happened in the United States. And I don't know all the details of them, but over the last couple centuries, there's been a lot of communes and stuff in the United States, people trying out experiments in community living. And as far as I know, they don't tend to have anything like this, like a covenant. And so they have tended to fall apart. Also because they tend to try like communism and stuff, but not all of them, right? Some of them are like Georgists or something,
Just a large percentage.
Say again? Yeah, just a large percentage.
Just a large percentage of them try to do communism and fail every single time because who knows? Maybe communism doesn't work. Again, you need.
Right. But the covenant becomes a key for what shall I call it? A serious experiment, right? As opposed to like, even this thing, I don't want to pick on them too much because I don't know totally what's involved, but the New Hampshire thing, what's that called? There's a name for it, where they're all libertarians moving to New Hampshire. You know what I'm talking about?
Free Staters.
The
I
Free
can't
Staters.
remember.
Yeah. So even for the Free Staters, as I understand it, literally it's just, hey, a bunch of libertarians should move to New Hampshire, and then there'll be enough of us that we can kind of get New Hampshire to be a freer place.
Yeah, and then they're just like, oh, we need to follow the NAP, and like obviously people are going to just accept that because the NAP is awesome or something. Like it's just not. It's not.
Right.
It doesn't factor in how humans actually behave and think.
Right, and I don't think that they have. I haven't been to it, but I think there's a festival that they do each year where they gather in New Hampshire, and various
I think
of my
it's called
friends have gone.
Pork Fest or something.
Pork Fest, yeah. I gather it's culturally, it's not exactly what Hapa would be like, given a big thumbs up to. In other words, in other words, they're being a little too loosey-goosey for the kind of success that we really need, right?
Yeah.
They're not really thinking it through. They're not thinking about the kind of people that basically you need to be selective, is what we're saying, right? You need to be selective, and you need to say, look, we're doing something very specific here. And if you don't want to be part of it, that's okay. There's the whole rest of the world, right?
Yeah. But
if you want to be part of this, you kind of got to agree with our basic principles, or it's just not going to work, right? Because it's Robert McKell's second law of politics or whatever. Am I mixing this up? No, I'm not saying the right name. But anyway, that any institution that is not explicitly right-wing will become taken over by left-wingers, right? Well, this is really a special case of what we could call the general Hoppian proviso here, right? Which is any community that isn't explicitly anti-state or pro-private property, is maybe even the better way to put it, will be taken over by people who are anti-private property.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And if not in the first generation, then in the second or the third generation or fourth or so on.
Exactly.
And this is why the covenant is so important. It's you can think of the covenant as a contract, an actual legal contract that effectively lays out the social contract of the community. And I don't mean social contract in the traditional social contract sense. I mean an actual contract.
Yeah, that
where
you have to
when you pass on your property to your children, they have to also sign the covenant before they actually gain ownership of the deed.
Right. So it would be a limit. It would be a limit on your property rights in the same way that if you move into certain neighborhoods, there's subdivision rules or community rules that you have to abide by, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that kind of thing.
Right, and this comes back to the idea of, as you said before, anything that's not explicitly right wing becomes left wing over time, and even things that are explicitly right wing can become left wing over time.
Yeah.
But we need to remember is that the foundations that all three of us are coming from here are primarily free market. We are coming from a foundation of the free market works. We understand that the free market works, and we're primarily, at least 2 out of 3 of us on the stream are coming from Austrian economic backgrounds. But in the future, if we're in this sort of environment, and we have other schools of thought, and obviously hopefully there will be people of other schools of thought who will come back and listen to this stream. If you start to use GeoEconomic means to forward your country's political goals, don't undermine the foundation of free trade and laissez-faire sort of economics. That is your foundation. Like everything, a country is built off that. It's built off private property rights. It's built off, knowing the rules of the game. It's built off non-sort of corporatist sort of actors. Corporatist sort of politics. So my fear is that with the implementation of GeoEconomics, it is again a way for sort of left-wing ideas to be brought into a society, because obviously, we're all pretty much on the right here, I'm assuming, and in saying that we are very careful in how we would quote, control, unquote, the economy for geoeconomic ends and geopolitical goals. But what I'm fearing from this conversation is that someone might take what we've talked about with geoeconomics, combine it with another school of thought that isn't an ideology that isn't as right wing, or to use a broader term, conservative, and these sorts of societies would drift to the left over time through these sorts of geoeconomic means. Does that make sense, or am I
right? But what I was picturing as I talked about there being competition, even for security provision for the community, right? Is that we can all be signed up to the covenant, which wouldn't, right, Matthias? It wouldn't spell out like strategies and tactics, right? It would be more of a principle. It'd be we all agree on these principles, and we all agree that you don't violate property rights and you don't steal, and it would just no matter who you are, even if your company is a security provision company, you may not do these things, right? So that's what we would all agree to. But then with geoeconomics, this really gets into tactical considerations, right? There's multiple ways to provide security geoeconomically, right, guys?
Yeah, definitely. But
yeah.
My point with that it has to be inside of the covenant is I'll give an example just to illustrate what I mean. So yes, we want competition between security providers, but we don't want, for example, a weapons manufacturer inside of the private law society to simultaneously be selling weapons to our militias and to the state that's attacking us.
Right. 100%. Yes. You don't want this sort of the private law society as an entity can act as a sort of middleman, but you don't want elements within the private law society itself acting as a middleman within the middleman, let's say, and using the benefits of the private law society to undermine the private law society.
Yeah, if you do that inside of the private law society, then you will be physically removed.
Okay, I'm gonna throw out something that I bet neither of you thought would come up. Okay.
I think we only have 3 minutes left on StreamYard, so we might want to hurry up.
What? What do you mean? Does it?
Don't
cut
we
us
only
off
have a limit? Yeah, it cuts it off at 2 hours, so we need to hurry.
I didn't know that.
We're pretty sure. So I was looking at the time there. I was like, "Oh, we're gonna cut this very close."
No. It's per month. It's per month.
Okay, sorry.
Free version is limited to 20 hours of streaming per month. We never get anywhere near that. Yeah, I do not think there is any such thing. You don't see a warning coming up, do you? I don't.
No.
No, I think we're okay.
It was 2 hour limit.
Okay, so let me throw something out that is a total left field, and I bet neither of you will have ever heard of what I'm about to say. There's somebody who was thinking about this from a completely different angle, and that is science fiction. Okay, I'm going to share a link. Let me sanitize it. There's a science fiction writer who I read a ton of called Gordon R. Dickson, and I'm going to share with you my favorite book. I read this book like 40 times. It's called Tactics of Mistake, but it's part of a whole series. And in it, he talks about a group of people called the Dorsai, who are mercenaries. They're private soldiers, basically, and they hire themselves out. That's sort of their main export, is that they hire themselves out to do security. In these books, he is thinking about a lot of the problems that I think Mathias is bringing up. And I wish I could go into more detail. I read these books a lot, but it was years ago. I'm actually planning to read this book, Tactics of Mistake, to my children next week, because it was such a favorite of mine. He and in particular, what I remember him gaming out in these books is this thing of playing powers off against each other, and having freedom for yourself in the midst of all this. Ultimately, of course, in this very book that I'm recommending, the main character of the book wants the Dorsai, this world of private mercenaries. He wants them to have independence, to have true sovereignty of the sort that I think Mathias is talking about. And the book is essentially about how they get there. So anyway, I don't know how much fiction can help, except that sometimes it's amazing how much someone writing fiction ends up thinking about the problems, because they're using their imagination. They're thinking through the kinds of things. And he really is writing, I think, as a sort of, he has very much a sort of libertarian anarchist angle. I don't know what his own political persuasion was, but in his writing, he's thinking about the kinds of problems that we're thinking about right now. Except he was doing it a long time ago. I mean, Tactics of Mistake, I don't know, it's saying a publication date of 2013, but that's not right. I read it a long time ago. No, the guy died in 2001. So it was decades ago that he wrote this stuff. So anyway, I recommend it to you. Tactics of Mistake in particular is a short one. And if it gets you hooked, then I think you'll want to read more from him. But he's wrestling with some of these very issues. So anyway, yeah, thought I'd throw that one out at you. Yeah, but I actually do want to move towards wrapping things up. We don't have a ton of super chats, so I don't think that'll take too long. But let me ask you, Mathias, what else did you want to make sure to bring up as we talk about geoeconomics? And let's be clear here. You've slid us to a related but different topic, right? Because private law societies are not something that your mainstream geoeconomist is going to be talking about, probably, right?
Yeah,
this is
what my interest is in this topic, right? What's
exactly right. So you've introduced us to the field of geoeconomics, which is just, I assume there's actually people. Are there people who call themselves geoeconomists, or is it a field of study?
It is a field, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So you've introduced us to this field, which is just a mainstream field of thinking about international affairs, I guess you could say. But then your interest now is in the intersection between geoeconomics and a private law or libertarian or anarcho-capitalist society, however you want to put it, where you're trying to look ahead a bit and try to game through, okay, great. Now we've got this covenant. Now let's hope it all works, right? We have, let's say, a little free city, so to speak, that's found its way to live between these economic zones and keep an existence going. Okay, but now in real life, it's going to have to contend with the people around it, with the states, the still statist regimes around it. How can it flourish and survive and grow? By playing them off against each other, by playing these geoeconomic games, and how can it do it all without violating the principles of the fundamental principles of the covenant of the community, which would be anarcho-capitalist principles, right? That's the puzzle you're bringing us to. Okay, well, as so often on this show, Mathias, I feel like we mostly almost introduce a topic, and it's like it's like part one. You know what I mean? Like we've set the stage for further thinking, but it would need a whole nother show to like go further with it, right? Because it just took this long to get us to the point, or me at least, to the point of understanding what geoeconomics is, and then now starting to think about how it meshes or doesn't mesh with well, I shouldn't call it libertopia, right? Because what we're really looking for, very practically, is not for this to break out in this macro way. And in fact, I wanted to call that out. I think that's something implicit in how you're thinking about this stuff, right, Mathias? And not just you, but people who are thinking along these lines. We don't think in terms of suddenly the United States is a big private law society.
Right, because that's not going to happen, right?
Yeah, we don't. It's going to happen. We don't really see a way that happens. What we see is small communities here and there who grow with, as I pointed out, the huge advantage they have of being productive, right? Freedom is more productive. It just so happens. Well, it's not just so happens, but free societies are more productive, and so they grow and they gain that soft economic power, you could say. and then you can apply that in various ways into other kinds of power. And I don't mean power in the bad sense, but power in the sense of influence, negotiating chips you can negotiate with, right?
Yeah, I mean, power is not inherently good or bad, right? It's just a fact of life. You need power to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Right. What's the old phrase? The strong do what they will, and the weak do what they must. Now, that doesn't mean that the strong are evil. That means that the strong just use their power. And yeah, I think we could do another stream on this entire topic because it's there's a lot more to go into. But I think just to leave it on, just to leave it before we go to super chats and other questions in the chat.
If I can just say, and the weak must leave us alone.
Okay, but before we drop the topic for super chats and chat questions, I think what we're going to find is that these natural. So we talked about before how natural industries. So, for example, your example with Britain and Portugal with wine and textiles. I think what we're going to find is that the natural resources and the natural advantages some nations have in these areas, with multiple spheres of influence now, are going to become more prevalent. Because in the past, well, today actually, you had this open trade, and you could pretty much get resources from anywhere in the world, relatively easy. But with different spheres of influence, the resources that you have in your nation become far more important in what you can actually specialize in and what you can actually have as domestic industry. And it will become very interesting to see the resource game become more prevalent. And I wonder how private law societies will, and just neutral states, in the matter of fact, will navigate that sort of resource realm. Just to put the question out there. We don't have to answer it now, but just to throw it out there for future discussion.
There's so many open questions in this whole thing. I'm nowhere near done thinking it through.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Well, that's helpful to hear, Mathias. It's not like you're bringing this and say, this is not a, what's it called? The kind of question where you already know the answer. It's not that kind of question.
Unfortunately, I wish, but no.
It's more that you're raising it for our larger community to start puzzling over, because you can see that it's key.
Yeah.
It's key to really having an ultimate success with this sort of thing.
Yeah, and I see this as our only way out from the current situation. I mean, I often repeat this thing also, like in conversations with Charlemagne a lot lately. There's really 3 ways out for us. The first one is violent revolution. The second one is the long march, which is what the left has done over the past decades.
Right.
And the last one is exit. And exit has been shut off for us for as long as the Cold War has been over. And violent revolution, if we do that, we all know how that's going to go. And the long march is blocked by the left. We're never going to get into the institutions. So
right. Well, okay. Now,
exit.
Academic Agent's video from this morning suggested something that doesn't sound like it necessarily fits into any of these. He talked about parallelism, just build new institutions.
Right.
Now, in some ways, what you're talking about is a form of parallelism in a way, right? He's just picturing it, I think, as within the current society, right? You homeschool or whatever. Whereas with private law societies, we're talking about actually starting a new setup over there, not
right.
geographically in the same place.
Yeah, I mean, are you familiar with Hopper's essay, What Must Be Done?
I've read it, but you'd have to remind me.
Well, high level, he is basically suggesting this. And this is one of the primary things that I disagree with Hopper on. I don't think it's possible to build parallel institutions inside of our society. I think no matter how decentralized you build it, the state is going to crush you
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I don't want to get into that discussion, but it is an interesting one. Okay, so let's turn to super chats. I already see at least one person saying we should have Mathias back for a part 2. I want to stew on what you've laid out for us, Mathias, and probably I will be up for it. Yeah, but I'd like to do some thinking of my own. Okay, I'm not going to promise I do this every time, but there's a limit in StreamYard. Things scroll off. So, but I can make banners. So, look at that. So Robert Walsh says, Ave Luna Rex Felicior Augusto Melior Traiano Ave Luna Rex, which means something like, Hail, King of the Moon, more fortunate than Augustus, better than Trajan, hail, King of the Moon. Thank you. And then Robert Walsh also says, check out Colin Flaherty. Okay, I believe I heard that name before from Don the Pleb, if I remember correctly. And I have subscribed to his channel, Colin Flaherty, and I just haven't been checking out the content much, just because, I have a lot coming at me. But this was in the context of the earlier discussion about the black middle class versus like the black middle class being the protesters and maybe the black lower class being more the rioters and so forth. Colin Flaherty focuses on some of these crime issues, I believe, with an eye towards the racial angle. So check him out if you like. I'm not recommending. I don't know it well enough, but he does seem to do his homework in the sense of he's really paying attention to like what's going on the ground. And trying to shine some light on things that maybe the mainstream press would not give as much attention to as it deserves. Our next super chat is from Christian Chad. Couldn't fit his name, but I could fit his whole chat. Have you looked in the case of Lebanon? The central bank ran a Ponzi scheme, absurdly high interest rates before the collapse. Currency has lost 70% of its value. P.S. All hail the people's champ. If you somehow missed it, I was declared the people's champion for unpopular opinions after a very unlibertarian and un-right-wing Democratic vote, as John D. pointed out.
Well deserved, though.
Well, thank you.
Indeed.
But it was great fun and great surprise because I really respect my fellow unpopular opinions folks. They're really interesting. So I was really surprised by that. But anyway, back to the main thing he's bringing up, Lebanon.
But hold on,
I don't know about that.
ladies and gentlemen, I do believe if you agree that radical liberation is the people's champion, the best way to prove that is with a subscribe and a like on this video, and subscribe to his channel to make sure that he really does know that he is the people's champion.
Yes, thank you. In fact, I wonder if I've hit it. I with a little bit of boosting from the shenanigans this week, I noticed that I'm near a round number on Twitter. Let's see, did I hit it yet? Oh shoot, how do I get my profile? Give me just a sec. I don't seem to be able to see how many subscribers I have. Profile, there we go. I have 2,998 followers on Twitter. So if a few hardy souls who aren't completely disgusted with that platform would follow me, I could hit 3,000, and wouldn't that be fun? Because it's a nice round number.
I would definitely subscribe if it wasn't because I've been banned from that platform for like 2 years.
Only banned once, unlike many people I know. Okay, so Lebanon. I don't know this story, I have to say. Are either of you familiar with it?
Yes.
Really?
One of the
tell me briefly.
Yeah, I mean, one of the major reasons that the Lebanese economy has suffered so much is because of the currency exchange rate fixing that they've been engaging in. They've had a fixed exchange rate on the US dollar for a very long time, which has created investment shortages and liquidity problems in the country. And yes, they've also engaged in, let's say, unsavory practices with their central bank. I mean, lots of corruption, and it's just all around. I mean,
so they didn't have
terrible estates, I think.
Oh, absurdly high interest rates. So did they have a hyperinflation? Would it be fair to say that?
Now, yes. I mean,
Wow.
basically everything is in shortages. Right now, water is only on once every couple of days. Electricity is only on a few hours a day. They don't have enough fuel oil to run basically anything. I mean, most fire trucks are sitting there without any gas or diesel. They don't have enough electricity to clean water with. They don't have the chemicals for it. They've just lost a bunch of fertilizer, and today there was a fire in a building right next to where the explosion was. I don't know if you saw the explosion in their harbor.
Yeah, I
Basically
did see
left
that.
a
Yeah.
giant
Yes.
crater. Half of the harbor is gone. But right next to it, there's a warehouse in a free trade zone where there was fuel and tires stored that went up in flames today.
Okay, I found two articles from National Review, believe it or not. I've shared them in the chat. In the second article I shared, which is actually the earlier article from July 23rd, he says, when I measured Lebanon's inflation rate yesterday, it was a sizzling 52.6% per month.
Yes.
Per month.
Yes.
So that annualized rate, he says Lebanon's annual inflation rate is 462%, he says, compared to Venezuela's annual rate at 2,219%. So anyway, I think that counts as hyperinflation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah,
I did not know about that. Bring it up.
Lebanon is ever since the civil war basically has been, or even before then to some extent, but ever since the civil war has been absolutely basically almost a non-functioning country to a limited degree. I mean, after the civil war, they went through some pretty bad poverty, and they're still in it because of the basically bad and unintended consequences of government action, which is again the risk that happens when you have government acting in a very authoritative way.
You're talking
the unintended
about
consequences.
You're talking about the intervention in Libya, right?
I'm just talking about that monetary and fiscal policy to be
okay.
more specific. I mean, that if you have
This
hyperinflation, you're not doing a good job.
This all started with Gaddafi being deposed or whatever.
No.
Right? Am I getting the right country? Oh, no, I'm getting the wrong country. Darn it. Sorry.
That's
don't know my North
country.
African countries. Okay, yeah, I did not know about this in Lebanon. Thanks for sharing that. Finally, Emo Hopian says, Lebanon.
Lebanon is in the Middle East, not in Africa.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what I'm talking about. Okay.
Sorry.
Emo Hopian, $5. Here's $5 for being awesome. Thank you. And that's it. Okay. Well, thanks very much. We're running a little long, so I should wrap it up. My wife's threatening to serve dinner without me. So thanks very much, Mathias. This is very interesting. I think I'd seen some of the conversations, but was just getting bits and pieces, and I didn't really understand what you've been thinking about. So I really appreciate you coming on and bringing us up to speed with not only GeoEconomics, but GeoEconomics from the anarcho-capitalist perspective, right? Which is a very interesting perspective to take it from. And unfortunately, we have the downside of it being pretty speculative, right? And maybe that's why my mind turned to science fiction that I'd read, because to some degree, we have to use our imagination to think about solutions to this because we don't have a lot of real life examples. There have been what I would think of as effectively anarchist societies in the past, sometimes for a long time, but a lot of those examples, we don't have a lot of detailed history, certainly not about like how did they deal with international relations.
Actually, I have a book recommendation there. I recommend the book A Companion to Medieval Genoa.
Ooh, okay. Let me see if I can get a link for that real quick to share. Companion to medieval Genoa.
You won't
And
be able
medieval
to,
Genoa-
but is it okay if I share an archive.org link?
Yeah. What is archive.org?
Well, it's how do you put it? It's
I mean,
like
that's fine. That's fine. Go ahead.
I'll share it.
You'll need to
As
send
long as
it
it's
to
not
me.
too spicy.
Yeah,
You'll
I
need it
posted
to-
it in show organization.
Oh, okay.
Well, archive.org is just like they save a bunch of documents and so on, and I put this book up on archive.org.
Okay, copy link. That's what I want. Okay, let me make sure that's right. That's the archive.org link. Okay, good. So there's the Amazon link to the book that is $229, or there's an archive.org link. Yeah, I think it's there. I don't know if anyone can see it, but anyway.
Yeah, it's there. I see it.
It's there. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Grab it while you can before YouTube deletes it. Okay, cool. Very interesting. And have you read the book?
Yes.
Okay, and medieval Genoa is was in some sense private or anarchist or something like that.
Yeah, it's what I would consider the closest thing in human history to a private law society.
Oh, really? Okay, interesting. Is it a lengthy book?
Yeah, I mean it's a history book.
Oh,
So,
588 pages.
yeah, and it's pretty dense, but I mean, I think it's interesting. There's information about how the legal system worked and
what period of
how-
history, roughly?
1100 to 1625.
Oh, for hundreds of years.
Yes. Yeah, it lasted for more than 500 years.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that is quite interesting. And does
Yeah.
it get into how it dealt with its neighbors and stuff, right?
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying if there's any real hard experience to learn from, it's probably in this book about Genoa.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, wow. Don't know if I can commit to a 600-page book before our next stream on the topic, but anyway. I wish I could.
If nothing else, then at least check out. I'll post an image from the book here, which is a little bit of a teaser.
Okay.
Just a second. Here is a map of Genoa.
Okay, and I ought to be
With
able to...
the 5 families. You definitely know at least one of the families, the Doria family, which was one of the aristocratic families of Genoa.
Okay, give me just a second. I might be able to actually... Let's see, I need to share Discord. There we go. There. Can you all see that? Okay, so yeah, let's take a look at this. Not sure how readable it is through the YouTube there, but okay, yeah. So Genoa has
What we're looking at there is the west coast of Italy, the northwest coast of modern day Italy, by the way.
okay,
Yeah, it's in Liguria.
and you're saying Genoa itself was internally decentralized with different Grimaldi. That sounds familiar.
Well, the Grimaldi family is the family that owns Monaco to this day.
Okay.
So that's
Is Monaco in this area?
Yeah, Monaco is right in the left there, lower left.
Oh, I see it. Okay. Yeah, so Monaco is actually a survival of medieval Genoa that never did get absorbed like the rest of it.
Yeah.
Wow. That makes it really interesting. Okay, yeah. I mean, like Hapa, I'm nostalgic for there being a gazillion principalities,
Oh, by the way, sorry, it says commune. I just want to clarify, it's not a communist commune, it's a medieval commune. And what it means is a defense pact.
Mm-hmm.
So you have all of these defense pacts, and then you have the aristocratic families.
Right. Wow. Okay, anyway, totally cool. Got to stop. All right. Thank you, Mathias. Lots to chew on for folks, I think, and fodder for future conversation as well. Let me check one more time on any super chats. I don't think so, but let me make sure.
If you would like to
Mine,
continue,
by the way.
if you would like to continue the conversation with us on a different platform, please consider joining our Discord server.
Which I did not. That's what I missed. I didn't put the link in.
Oh no, it's all right. We will put the link in there, but please go consider joining the Discord server and enter into that currency competition. Again, the prize for that is silver. Thank you, Matthias, for coming on the show. Your wealth of knowledge is invaluable.
Yes,
Pleasure
thank
is
you.
entirely mine, as I said.
Okay.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks, Matthias. Okay, we're going to go off air. Here we go.